Roger Williams University is hosting a crisis management seminar on May 3rd at their Providence campus. Crises, whether a natural disaster, cyber attack, or financial instability, can have severe repercussions if not handled properly. This is where crisis management plays a pivotal role. Join Roger Williams MBA students and expert speakers to learn how to prepare for the unexpected. The program is totally free and open to the public. You can register online at rwu.edu/events/crisis-management-symposium.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Yeah. Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me on today. My name is Zane Wolfang. I currently work as the full-time government reporter for the Newport Daily News, which is a USA Today paper and thus a Gannett-owned paper. So we are independent of the Providence Journal, for instance, which is also Gannett-owned, but have the same executive editor. So that's sort of where I fall in the Rhode Island media landscape.
Very cool. And, you join us today in the midst of, look, we're getting into the warmer season. So it's the time of year where historically issues of homelessness, the unhoused, start to fade a little bit. It jumps onto the front page and the top of newscasts just as it starts to get cold. And then as it warms up, look, it doesn't retain the same type of news value. Nonetheless, the problem is still there. So we're here today mostly on sort of some enterprise reporting that you did surrounding the Cranston Armory that we had talked about, and I thought was really interesting, and I'm very pleased to be able to present, but kind of set the table for why you started to take a look at what was happening at the Armory and, so to speak, everything surrounding the homeless crisis here in the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we both know the age-old expression that all politics is local, and homelessness and housing insecurity and food insecurity, right, are three topics that we cover at the Newport Daily News when we look at Newport County. I think a lot of people think of Newport and they think of the mansions,
right,
and that sort of kind of Gilded Age or neo-Gilded Age kind of atmosphere. But as you well know, Newport's a very diverse city by a variety of metrics, and Newport County, like every other county in the state, is encountering these same issues with housing insecurity, and that sort of tied into an acute homelessness issue. So I wrote a piece on January 31st for the Newport Daily News about how there were no available homeless shelter beds in all of Newport County, right, which would be all of Aquidneck Island, plus Jamestown, Little Compton, and Tiverton. So it's not that there are no homeless shelters there, no beds, but they are all full. Yep. And then there are more people who still need shelter. And like Newport did open an emergency warming shelter sometime in February, March. People really sprang into action, Mayor Tsai and some local institutions there. But so that was something that I was paying attention to locally. And then being a Rhode Island native, born and raised in Warren, still live in Warren, I think that sort of all politics is local expression. Everything is local in Rhode Island. Yeah. Even if you live in Smithfield, if you live in Newport, you're still affected by what's happening in Providence, or many of us have lived in Providence at different points in our life, even if we kind of have cycled in and out of the suburbs. So I started paying attention to that Armory shelter conversation pretty early on as well, because I saw strong parallels to, this is not a problem that's just affecting Providence. This is not a conversation that only people in the West End are having. This is something people across the state.
Absolutely. And even as the Armory, the way it was pitched was, look, this is a statewide, quote unquote, type of facility. And there were even some expectations from the Woonsocket administration that, hey, if you're experiencing homelessness in Woonsocket, get on a bus and go to the Armory. So the Armory, in theory, even though obviously in practice it was not a practical solution, it was designed as a way to say, okay, we have a major stamp on a statewide issue.
Right. And I wonder to the extent of whether or not it was a practical solution. And we can speak about like my specific experience. The night that so Bill played a little coy to let me sort of explain what I did. As these conversations about the Armory shelter sort of heated up, and as for a brief period of time, the weather started to get a little bit warmer, people looked towards closing the shelter, which was always supposed to be an emergency shelter. And it's interesting that you actually had critiques of that shelter from opposing camps, right? Like you had people being like, close this shelter entirely and don't ever open it again as an emergency warming shelter or any other type of shelter. And then you have people who are really strong advocates for the unhoused, who are like, the armory is inhumane and the conditions are suboptimal and they're not suitable for people. And I think that I really do fall in the middle of those two things. So I walked there on March 3rd, quite late on a Friday night. And if people recall that night, it was like a mix of snow and rain. It was cold, right around, just hovering over freezing temperatures. Like, it was really a nasty night. And that's part of why I decided to go that night. I was like, oh, this is the perfect time to see who needs a warming shelter. And, I was dressed adequately, but not, I wasn't bundled up, in Eskimo gear. I had a puffy jacket on, but no raincoat. I had wool socks on, but no boots, just sneakers. Phone was dead. So I was like, oh, this is kind of, for someone in my privileged position where I can return to being housed the next day. I'd really like to see what it's like to need emergency shelter in Providence, to know that the Armory is the only place in town, and to see what it's like to slog through the snow and get there and see how you're greeted and intaken and what the situation is inside. Yep. And, my impression is that there's a lot of well-meaning people on both sides of the debate about the Armory, or on the multiple sides of the debate about the Armory. And some of them have certainly spent time in there, right? I'm sure some Providence police officers have more familiarity with having been inside the shelter, the National Guard staff, the Amos House staff, and probably community advocates from a variety of nonprofit organizations. So I don't want to posit that nobody has firsthand experience or no one knows what they're talking about. But I do think there's quite a few people who are invested in this conversation, homeowners in the neighborhood, et cetera, who have probably never set foot in this shelter or in any shelter. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't, going to look for anything spectacular to happen, or, oh, I'm only going to write something if violence occurs, or if conditions are deplorable. Like, I just wanted to go be a person who needed shelter and get taken in as any person would. And that's what I did. And there were well over 100 people in there. Mm-hmm. Every cot was full, plus people sleeping in chairs. Like, that's what I decided to do, is, kind of set myself up to observe everything.
Like a folding chair, or what kind of chair?
Yeah, like a plastic folding chair. Wow. Kind of the classic bifold plastic tables. There's probably about 6 or 8 of those to your left when you walk in. The National Guard screens you with the little wands like you would at the airport, for instance. And then, there's around 100 cots, kind of just green kind of camping cots or military style cots set up. And then there's a few pews to the left of those. And all of that was full. People sleeping on the cots, people sleeping on the floor, people sleeping on the pews.
People sleeping on the floor, no mat, people sleeping on church pews, just body on wood. Yeah.
And, like at one point in the night, an Amos House employee came by to my chair and offered me, he was like, do you want a cot? There's one for you. And I said no. So I assume that there's some element of like, there's no cots available, so I need to find another place. And there's some element of like, I don't want to sleep surrounded by everybody else. I want my own space is more valuable to me than the added comfort of the cot. Or, I approached the night as if like, wow, this is my first night being unhoused. Not what would I do? Like, what will I do? What am I going to do in this exact situation where I would literally be unhoused? And if it was my first night and I didn't know the rules of the game, and I wasn't, hadn't been unhoused for a prolonged enough period of time to sort of understand how things work in those spaces, I would separate myself from the crowd and be in a place where I could see everything and assess the situation. And so that's what I did. But I assume other people are of the same mind. Mm-hmm, so in terms of this being a pragmatic solution, there's a lot of people that correctly recognize a housing crisis and sort of a downward pressure on housing stock and options for everybody, right? When somebody who makes $1 million can outbid someone who makes $500,000 for a big house, and then the $500,000 person, can outbid the $100,000 person, and then the $100,000 person can rent an apartment that someone who makes $50,000 would have gotten, right? That's that in my opinion, this downward pressure. So I think people who are against the shelter are sort of really honing in on that. All those 100 people, as far as I can tell, would have been really struggling to find a place to sleep that wasn't in the snow if the armory wasn't open.
So it's that or nothing, basically. You're talking a scenario where it's like, this is imperfect and you might be sleeping on a church pew, but your alternative is to be out in the elements on a snowy night.
Yeah, I tell you what, it felt damn good to get inside there. Mm-hmm. At the end of my walk, at the end of being outside in the snow, shoes soaking wet, nowhere else to go. I mean, I could have gone and paid for a hotel room, or, you know, taken the last strip the bus back into Warren and called my brother up, to come. Like I had those options, because I'm not an unhoused person. Mm-hmm. I'm a newspaper reporter who has enough going for me in life and enough of a support system that I don't have no options. But my impression is that a lot of people in that shelter needed to be there. So is that a pragmatic solution? In my opinion, yes. Right, being warm and dry, having a place to sleep, being served a cup of hot coffee and a basic breakfast in the morning is infinitely better and more dignified. And on a night like that is legitimately, not in a hyperbolic sense, but legitimately a lifesaver.
Yeah, right. That's what I was going to say. I mean, it's like if your options are sleeping in the snow or sleeping inside anywhere, everything else is secondary at that point. Although we should be obviously working towards a situation where nobody has to sleep in the snow and so on and so forth. Like there's the utopian aspect of things, but then there's also, hey, what are we really going to do here?
I think that, there's a level, I don't want to be too harsh. Maybe disingenuous isn't the right word, but there's a level of resistance to stopgap solutions because they are not the perfect end all be all utopia solution. Yep. And that is what I think is not pragmatic. Right, to say like, oh, the real solution is housing. So until we build, 600 units of housing indexed to people who make between 30 and $60,000 or less dollars a year, we're not going to put anyone in the armory because we don't like the increased trash or emergency situations in the neighborhood. That's, in my opinion, a little bit disingenuous. Like you do need both. It's an emergency shelter, and this, just because it's not an emergency that you face or I face every day, like doesn't mean it's not an emergency. Right. It's just not on our minds. And I would say on the other side, a journalist colleague of mine asked me sort of about the other end of like, oh, were the conditions deplorable in there? Was it, it was not the Four Seasons, it wasn't as comfortable as sleeping in my bed at home. But the amount better it was than being in the snow was a way bigger gap than the amount worse it was than having your own house. Yeah. So that is, my kind of like moderate take on that is like, could things be improved on? Yes. But I would think that many others in that situation as well would have had that same feeling of relief to have been in the cold and the wet and step into a place that's warm and dry where there are at least some basic services for you. Now, I understand very much why I think, families with children would not feel very good there. Nothing egregious was happening, but, when I arrived, like I went to check out the porta potties first. And, the porta potties at Bonnaroo are worse for what, for what it's worth. Okay. Yeah. For anyone who's like, oh, right. they're so heinous. Like, no, I've seen many a worse porta potty that many of us would still have used in a pinch. So, and while I was in there, I heard this sort of disembodied voice offering cocaine and weed. So there's drug sales happening. There is certainly that element, and as I said, I didn't see anything egregious. I saw some few minor altercations about this is my cot or what have you. The National Guard stepped in there very professionally, nothing violent or untoward, just sort of de-escalating people very quickly. But there's tension. People there are desperate. People there don't have a lot. So if you're a family with children, maybe you don't want to go to sleep on a cot surrounded by people you don't know and there's some tension and aggression in the air. So it's certainly not a perfect situation.
But it's a better alternative than being on the street.
100%. And I think, some of the critique has come as like, oh, since the shelter opened, I've had to clear people off my steps. I've had people have left stuff in my yard. It's not clear to me why people think that if the armory containing 100 or more people in it on any given night closes, why they think those people are going to leave the neighborhood.
Right. Other than the notion that maybe there are some people on that are there on a statewide basis that it becomes a magnet of sorts. But there's already an enormous unhoused population in that neighborhood, and you're right that like if you don't have 100 people inside the armory, you might not have 100 people on your stoop, but you're going to have a lot of people who are in the area who have nowhere else to go. And if you're looking at it from the standpoint of I want to, I don't like this vibe or something like that, however you approach it, the armory is not in and of itself the problem.
Right. I would sort of anticipate more friction with private property owners
Right.
if the shelter were to close, because people would maybe be trying to sleep under your steps, or, if there's no armory, I'm looking for a place that snow is not falling on to sleep. And maybe that's someone's garage, or maybe that's a vacant build. I don't think that that the issues or the tension between the local property owners and the people who have no property go away because the armory shelter closes down.
Right.
In my opinion. So, kind of seeing both sides there. And, I think that the notion that shelters should be humane and should offer a great environment for people is good, right, on the one side. But I think that blasting the armory because it has problems that old buildings have, or because the services aren't optimal is a little bit tough when it's way better than having nowhere to go. Right. And then I think on the other end, positing, for instance, the housing package in the House as like the end all be all, like, oh, we're going to legislate our way out of this problem. Anyone who's following the affordable housing issues in the state knows that stock has been climbing very slowly.
Yeah.
Right. For decades, it's been a problem. For decades, there's been this goal, the stated goal of having at least 10% affordable housing amongst the stock of every municipality. The framework to achieve that doesn't seem to be very effective,
Absolutely.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
So I think like saying, oh, we're going to, shut the armory down forever because I don't like what it's doing to my neighborhood that I moved into, by the way, with the purchasing power to buy a property. Right. Some people are just there and have been housing insecure or pushed into housing insecurity by market dynamics and by things like that. So, I don't think that's really a fair or an effective critique either, to be like the shelter's not pragmatic, but what is pragmatic is taking decades to build an inadequate number of houses. That just doesn't make sense.
And we talked about that extensively actually this week on the podcast with Jay O'Grady from LISC on it's like a 45-minute breakdown of why building affordable housing is so difficult. It's not just a supply and demand issue. There's so much that goes into it, and it's a very tedious and troubling process that is not going to get us to where we need to be by next year. So in sum, your takeaway, the big takeaway, if I hear you right, is that the armory's not perfect. It was a good stopgap for people, especially on a night like you experienced where it's cold and snowy and wet outside. There are aspects of the armory that are some of the criticisms of the armory are valid in that there's some narcotic sales. There's, it's not perfect. It's not where you necessarily want to be, but at the end of the day, it's a better option than nothing. And although that shouldn't be our stated goal or our end game, given the nature of the situation, it was not a failed project. And a lot of the NIMBYism that took place in reaction to that is unwarranted simply on the grounds of, had the armory not been there, in your opinion, many people who were unhoused would likely still be in that area, and if not more people than were there as a result of the armory.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation. And then I think also this notion of like, oh, everyone's coming from out of Providence.
Yeah.
A, that's not true.
Yeah.
B, for years, a number of people with more kind of acute economic or socioeconomic needs have been funneled to places like Woonsocket by the state.
Right.
Recently, within maybe the last month or 2 months, an unhoused man passed away on a park bench in Woonsocket. It caught a little bit of Uprise, of course, covered it. Steve Alquist, who is, Uprise certainly has its viewpoint, which might turn some people off. But I think as someone who works in media, something I respect about them is simply the amount of things they cover that no one else is covering.
They're in places where nobody else is. Look, it's got a progressive slant. So what? Yeah. There's many outlets in Rhode Island that have either a corporatist slant or a right-wing slant. So, it just is what it is. So I agree. And Alquist was on Bartholomew Town shortly after that terrible incident in Woonsocket. And, the emotion in his voice as this was described, he's on the ground there. And you're right that there are those instances. The mayor of Woonsocket has done, or I shouldn't necessarily call Baldelli Hunt out exclusively, but Woonsocket's got a problem. And they don't seem to want to deal with it. And they have this imaginary idea that people are going to take the bus to the Armory, and that's going to resolve all their problems. When a lot of the unhoused people in Woonsocket, their jobs in Woonsocket, their health care is in Woonsocket. That includes behavioral health. That includes substance abuse treatment. Their communities in Woonsocket, and all of a sudden they're going to take a bus to Providence to sleep on a church pew in the Armory every single night. It's just not realistic.
I agree with that. But I also I didn't even bring it up to criticize Woonsocket, but more so to point out that people who are like, oh, people are getting bussed in from Woonsocket. Well, actually, for years, certain problems have been exported from Providence and other places and sent to Woonsocket.
Yes.
So it's a two-way street, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And there is more state funding associated with some of those things, but there's a reason that Woonsocket has a very high refugee population. There's a reason that Woonsocket public school system takes on people with acute special needs and education, right? There's some state funding that goes along with it, but those are all thorny and difficult problems to deal with. And not only problems for the state or for, this is a fundamental thing that is not just about Providence.
Yeah, totally.
When we say that there's a homelessness problem around Dexter Park, for instance, in the West End, who is homelessness a problem for? Mm-hmm. Is it a problem for the person with a house who has to see and deal with those people? Or is it a problem for the people who are homeless? Maybe both to some extent, but a lot of political discourse amongst the property class, and this is not always mean-spirited, but I think is sometimes from kind of a lack of perspective, from not having ever spent time in a shelter, or not really having ever lived a life where you were at that sort of risk, right? Homelessness being viewed as fundamentally a problem for people with homes is, in my opinion, not the correct way to view that problem, right? Yep. Being unhoused is a problem for the people who are unhoused, and they need some sort of support. Yeah. Or if people don't want to support them, they are just going to be out in the street doing what they need to do to support themselves.
That's right. And good on you for jumping in and doing that enterprise work and really getting that experience. Zane Wolfang, Newport Daily News, speaking on his own behalf here. What can people expect from you in this regard going forward? What other? I mean, you don't want to give away the stories you're working on, of course, but what's next in coverage of the homeless crisis in Rhode Island from either a statewide or a Newport angle?
Yeah, I think I'd almost like to, if it's okay with you, to highlight some other people's work, because that is also some critiques that I saw online from one person. We discussed in particular. I saw a retweet. Media covers homelessness in Rhode Island as a Christmas time morality play rather than the most extreme manifestation of a severe general housing crisis. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, kind of a cheap shot at the media, or perhaps just a sign that people are not aware of what's out there and being reported on. So I want to highlight the work first of a USA Today colleague, Amy Russo, who's on the city desk at Projo, just recently wrote a piece about a presentation on the Armory shelter closing they use the word, Providence Journal used the word grim, some very grim numbers about homelessness. They have a tabulation of about 1,400 homeless people in the state. And the state did just do a statewide count. Jimmy Winters from Newport Housing Hotline spoke to us at Newport Daily News about that. There's 950 shelter beds, not counting emergency shelter beds in the state. So there's 1,400 homeless counted, and there's 950 beds available for them, right? And if we're going to close places like the Armory, that are, sheltering literally hundreds of people every night. Where are they going to go?
Yeah.
So Amy just wrote that piece. Armory Shelter closes in a month. That was on March 28th that it was published. And then Alexa Gagos works in the Rhode Island bureau of the Boston Globe and does some really excellent work. And she wrote a piece in December about a couple named Harley Barchi and Keel Strong, who have 4 kids, both born and raised in Rhode Island, and have an annual income of about $80,000 a year. And they've been homeless for almost a year. Right. And the tagline there was like, this can happen to everyone. And then the Globe, so that was written in December. And then the Globe followed up very recently. Ed Fitzpatrick, who I believe is the bureau chief over there.
He's a reporter. McGowan's the bureau chief, but yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So Ed Fitzpatrick has a Rhode Island Report podcast, and he brought Alexa and Holly Barchi on to discuss that article. So I think that's a wonderful opportunity for Rhode Islanders. And from what the Globe staff said, that story has gained some traction in the State House, and some legislators are certainly aware of that. But Holly Barchi is, a woman, 2-parent household, both of them working every day, and they have been homeless for an extended period of time. And there's some interesting reasons why. I would encourage people to listen to that podcast episode that just came out a few days ago, because you'll hear from Ed, you'll hear from Alexa, who actually did the reporting, and makes a point about Rhode Island not having a right to shelter law for families.
Unlike Massachusetts, which does, right?
Exactly. That was the comparison. But you'll also hear Holly, just a fellow Rhode Islander like yourself, presuming a lot of your listeners are Rhode Islanders, right? Speaking about her and her family's experience of sort of spiraling into homelessness and continuing to work and to pay for different housing options, campgrounds, etc., and really struggling to find housing. Yeah. And her message is really, this is not just some poor people in your imagination or someone that you don't have to see, or someone you prefer not to see in your neighborhood. It could be someone who's in a house today or is renting today, who finds himself in a real tricky situation tomorrow.
That's right. That's the lesson renters there from the Strong family, is that, and again, there are a lot of details there, and I think it's worth understanding all of those. Give it a listen if you haven't yet. Our friends over at the Boston Globe. But yeah, you're right. It's an important thing to highlight.
Yeah. And then the last thing, I guess, not to take too much of your time, Bill, right. We talked in the beginning about, and even, critics of the shelter have made the same connection between the housing crisis in Rhode Island, which is not going away, and is being actively discussed and addressed in the state. I will add, it's not like people are unaware of the housing crisis. Maybe they're less aware of the homelessness issue. But I wrote an article recently for the Newport Daily News about how there's actually more homes in the 1 million to 10 million plus bracket available for sale in Newport County, or in Newport specifically, than there are under $500,000.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, totally. It's out of control. It's completely 100% out of control. And I think it's a market that you would expect will not necessarily collapse, but will, there's going to be some bottom that falls out, because some of those homes, take a look at Newport. They're not $1 million homes. They just aren't. But because the market is driven that price point, they are $1 million homes. So we're going to have a reset at some point, and I think it's likely some people are going to find themselves underwater with some of these houses they purchase. And our housing stock is targeting a market that is not necessarily reflected in the needs of the state as a whole.
Right. Well, people are either going to leave the state if they have the ability to relocate to work, or some people like Holly and Keel Strong are going to end up on the street, even though they are Rhode Islanders who are hardworking and supporting their families. Yeah. And in other issues as well, like in Middletown, they're trying to build some new schools. There's a proposal for quite a large bond to build new schools there. And there was some discussion at a recent town council meeting about curriculum and about how the school system is doing. And Teresa Spengler, the superintendent, mentioned there are 80 students in Middletown's public school district who are homeless.
Yep.
So this issue is more pervasive than people realize. I hope, maybe my takeaway was my thing was do people really need this shelter? Let me go out on a very raw night and see what it's like and see how you're treated, right? It wasn't the Four Seasons, but also I was not treated badly. I was provided with adequate shelter and a breakfast and coffee in the morning. And my impression is that people really need these emergency shelters. They need to be placed somewhere. And sort of as a corollary to that, they need the compassion of their fellow Rhode Islanders to work towards a more permanent solution.
Couldn't agree more with all of that. Zane, thanks so much for your time and great work out there. Keep it up and keep pounding on the island as well, because great reporting is something that we all need. But a place like Newport and Newport County benefits greatly from a robust media ecosystem of which you're a key part of, and I appreciate your work.
Thanks a lot, Bill. $1 for 3-month subscription to the Daily News. Got to plug it. It's not too expensive.
It's not too bad. CCA Health Rhode Island, Commonwealth Care Alliance, or CCA, is a multi-state integrated care system influencing innovative models of complex care nationwide. CCA Health's Uncommon Care model focuses on sustainable and evidence-based healthcare breakthroughs that improve the health and well-being of people with significant needs, and is consistently recognized as one of the best models in the country at identifying and serving traditionally hard-to-reach individuals. CCA is excited to bring Uncommon Care to Rhode Islanders with a range of Medicare Advantage plans. Learn more by visiting commonwealthcarealliance.org/Rhode Island. You've been hearing me talk a lot about the University of Rhode Island's online cannabis certificate program. And with the legalization of recreational cannabis that went into effect last year, well, cannabis can open up doors for your career. Whether you're already in the industry or just wondering what is a pathway to break into the field, the University of Rhode Island has that program to help you become highly competitive in numerous areas of the cannabis industry. Fully accredited by URI's College of Pharmacy, the certificate program is 100% online and it can be completed in just 2 semesters. The next application deadline for the summer 2023 session is April 4th, coming right up. And courses start on May 9th. Learn more at uri.edu/online/cannabis or give them a call at 401-874-5280.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.